Hi there. In this video, we are going to go over the hero's journey from ordinary to extraordinary. My name is Christopher, and let's get rolling right into it. So I pulled from a couple of different books for this particular topic. So Carl Jung's Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he really goes into archetypes in that one. And then mainly Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth and Joseph Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and then some more archetypal material from Mary Louise von Franz's The Interpretation of Fairy Tales as well. So if you'd like any of those books, they are down in the description. So while I was doing some research for this, I actually found in the foreword to The Power of Myth that Joseph Campbell, who's pictured here on the right, and Bill Moyers, who actually interviews Joseph Campbell for the material in this book, they did a couple of interviews, and this is actually George Lucas, who is the director of Star Wars. And so they would meet at George Lucas's ranch here called Skywalker Ranch, and they would have these interviews together, and Joseph Campbell would actually help to sort of facilitate and coach George Lucas on the process of the hero's journey and to incorporate some of those themes that Joseph Campbell has spent his life learning about. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to go into why this is important. It's important for a couple of reasons, but I think that this quote sort of brings a good summation as to why it's important. So the quote says, "The images of myth are reflections of the spiritual potentialities of every one of us. Through contemplating these, we evoke their powers in our own lives." That comes from Campbell's book, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this, but that's why it's important, is because these myths show us what is happening inside of our psyche, so we can learn about ourselves through myth. So just a quick disclaimer, Joseph Campbell was a man born in 1904, and so he comes with some of the shadow complexes of the early 1900s, and a lot of his work was centered around this idea of the hero, and that's a word I'm going to be using today because we're going to be talking about the hero's journey. I want to acknowledge that that this is not a masculine-dominated topic, that the idea of the heroine is very much part of this conversation as well, and I'm going to be using hero as an interchangeable word, meaning both masculine and feminine, so I want to incorporate the heroine and the feminine when I'm talking about this as well, that it goes for both, that hero is not a word that only means man, and so I wanted to include that in this process as well. And then to understand what we're talking about, it's important to understand the idea of the archetype. So I made a whole video on this if you want to nerd out and deep dive into more about what an archetype is. But for the sake of this, we're going to consider an archetype as an organizing principle, an image which is embedded in all human psychic processes. The Cliff Notes version of archetypes are that they are blueprints of energetic patterns within the psyche that energy naturally flows through, and they exist across all human beings. And so that brings us to the idea of the monomyth. So if we break down the etymology of the word monomyth, we get mono and myth. So mono is a word that means one, so the one myth, the one story. And what Joseph Campbell, a lot of his work was centered around, was discovering that across cultures there is resemblances in creation stories. And even though these communities were isolated from each other, they still came up with the same images. For instance, the idea of the dragon. That is an image that is across many different cultures that did not have contact with each other. This image emerged, Joseph Campbell believes, from the image of the eagle, which is always an airbound creature, and the snake, which is always an earthbound creature, and the intermingling of those two, the marriage, the tension of the opposites, creating a third. And so Joseph Campbell discovered through his work and through his life that he started to recognize in all of these different creation stories that there was a similar story that was evolving and unraveling, and he recognized that in myths there are certain trademarks of how the story goes, and he started seeing this across many different cultures and myths, and he started recognizing that there's one story that's repeating itself in every single story. And so that's the idea of the monomyth. And so the monomyth exists. You can also think of it in the concept, which this quote does a very good job, is that we're all human beings, and we all have psyches that function off of basic principles within the organization of the human structure, of the psychic structure. And this quote kind of goes into that a little bit. So I'm going to read this to you. So you've got the same body with the same organs and energies that Cro-Magnon man lived 3,000 years ago. Living a human life in New York City or living a human life in the caves, You go through the same stages of childhood, coming to sexual maturity, transformation of the dependency of childhood into the responsibility of manhood or womanhood, marriage, then failure of the body, gradual loss of its powers, and death. You have the same bodily experiences, and so you respond to the same images. Obviously, we all have different stages and different places we go through, but we all experience aspects of being a human. We're all born, we all go through sexual maturity, puberty, and we all die. So we all have a similar story in some way. And so that's what the monomyth is describing, is the human story, or the one story that we're all living. So this is the hero's journey. And I got this image from CBC, so thank you, Canada. And the hero's journey has, there's different ways that it's structured. Some people structure in 12 different parts, some people structure in 3 different parts. They all follow a similar story and theme, though. So we're going to be talking about those themes. But basically, there are 3 essential parts that Joseph Campbell talks about in the hero's journey. So we have the departure, we have the initiation, and the return. So the departure and the return are what are in our known universe. And the initiation process is what is in our unknown process. So we can have the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the unknown. And essentially, as you can see, it's in a circle. They all are returning to that same spot that we started. If you're familiar with the book The Alchemist, you'll recognize that the treasure that he was seeking was found at the very beginning of the story, in the place that he had slept. That we end up in the exact place that we were when we started, yet we are different. You know, we're never in that same river twice. The energy is always flowing. We're different, and the river is different. So just to get into these real quick, we're going to dive into these all in a second as well. But the departure is this sense of separation, that we're leaving our known world and we're going into the unknown world. And we have this pivotal moment, the crossing of the threshold, where we officially leave the known world, enter the unknown world. We sort of enter into the call, then there's typically a refusal of the call, and then we receive help, and then we cross the threshold. And then the belly of the whale's right on the other side of crossing the threshold. In the initiation process, we are now in the unknown world. This is where we meet the road of trials. We have different help along the way, and then we typically experience a very pivotal moment known as the ordeal, the death of self, apoptosis, whatever that typical word is, and then we move back through the unknown world, transformed after the ordeal or the abyss. The return. So in the return, we have the refusal of the return. After we've been in the magical world or the unknown world, there's typically a refusal to return back into the ordinary way of living. And then eventually we receive the ultimate reward. And then we come back to the Master of Two Worlds, having been through the initiation process, knowing the known and the unknown, only to begin it again in our spiral way of going through life. So I also wanted to talk about this idea of society and the hero's journey. So if we were to take these same images and recognize that society, for instance, is like a river. Society has currents. It's taking the water in certain ways. And society is very easy for us. If we are to just put our hands up and float down the river, we would go to wherever society is taking us. Society is what is known as the known world in the hero's journey. It's our sense of comfort. It's our comfort zone. We don't have to think much. We don't have to do much. Society will take care of things for us. Now, the way that the hero's journey relates to this is that over here we have the forest. So in the forest, we have the unknown. We have the sense of adventure. We don't know what's in the actual forest. And so the process here with the hero's journey is that we are going into the unknown, coming back, essentially dying, and then returning to society with our gifts, only to leave and come back in. So the forest here is a symbol for original experience. In society, we do not have original experience or subjective experience. We're experiencing what society is experiencing. But when we break away from the river, from the current of society, we get to have our own experience of the world. And it's from that own experience that we get to learn gifts and different ways of living, which we can then integrate and bring back into society. So that's essentially what the hero's journey is that we have this sense of leaving society, entering into a world of individuality, having some kind of transformation, and then returning to society, returning to community with the rewards that we have, and recognizing that we're not an individual, that we are a part of a community and society greater than ourselves. So I think that's really important to understand. So we're going to start here with part one, the departure. And so remember that what we're describing here is an internal process. We're going to be using myths and different movies and stories to talk about the hero's journey. But remember that all these parts are internal processes that exist inside of us. So the call to adventure, where it all begins. So this is the part where the hero receives a call to embark on their journey, leaving their ordinary world. This is when something out of the ordinary occurs in life that all of a sudden brings us into a contact with the unknown, that reminds us that there's something else going on in the world, something deeper than our day-to-day lived experience. If you are familiar with Lord of the Rings, this is when Frodo receives the ring. This is Frodo's going about his day-to-day world. He's living in the Shire, a very comfortable and safe place. Nothing was really going on. And then all of a sudden he gets pulled into this adventure through this ring, the call to adventure. Harry Potter is very similar as well. He's living with his stepfamily, and he is now all of a sudden initiated in the way of receiving magical letters that come through the mail. So all of a sudden there's this call to adventure. He's literally receiving a letter in the mail telling him and calling him to the world that is required of him. Next, we have the refusal of the call. So this is when the hero initially hesitates or refuses to accept the call due to fears or obligations. If you remember in that Frodo example, Frodo tried to give the ring to Gandalf. He tried to get rid of it. He did not want the call to adventure. The call to adventure means that we have to leave our known universe. So there's typically a refusal in some way. We have to leave our comfort zone. There's hesitation, discomfort, and resistance in doing that. These, like in Star Wars, for example, if you're familiar with Star Wars, this is the moment when Luke rejected going with Obi-Wan Kenobi to out into the universe to save Princess Leia. He wanted to stay home and deal with the harvest. He knew that was coming up, and he wanted to stay living his quaint and small farm life as opposed to going out and saving the universe. This is when Simba refuses to return to be king as well in The Lion King. And so we recognize that with this aspect that there is a refusal in some way, that there is a current running against what the hero needs in order to transform. Then we have the third part, which is supernatural aid. So this is when the hero receives help in some magical form, when Luke receives his father, Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber from Obi-Wan Kenobi, or this is when Neo receives help from Morpheus in The Matrix, that there's some sort of help from a mentor or some kind of guidance that allows the hero to receive the strength that they need to cross the threshold to continue on their journey. And that is where we get into crossing the threshold. So this is an extremely important part, because once we cross the threshold, there is no turning back, that we do end up having to go through this process. And our psyche knows that, and there's a resistance to it. And then when we eventually do cross, there's almost like a moment of surrender with that. And that's when we leave our known world and we enter into the unknown or the special world. Very common examples of this are like Alice falling down the rabbit hole and going to Wonderland. And then we have Dorothy entering the land of Oz and the Wizard of Oz, that all of a sudden we are now in the unknown, the magical world. Things are different than our ordinary day-to-day lived experience. After that, we enter into what is known as the belly of the whale. We go past that magical experience, and then now we are in it. We are in the belly of the whale. This is obviously a biblical reference as well, but it shows up in many other cultures too. This is the moment when Luke, Han, and Chewbacca attempt to rescue Princess Leia, and they end up in the garbage compactor. You know, they're actually getting crushed. It's very much like, if you look at the garbage compactor, it looks like the belly of a whale. There's a bunch of trash and gross and claustrophobic feelings in there, and it's like, oh my gosh, we've crossed into something. In this particular instance, they are now in the Death Star. They can't get out of there. They have committed. They're now in the unknown world. Same with the Mines of Moria in Lord of the Rings. The Mines of Moria also are the belly of the whale. There's somehow a sense of being trapped, a sense of no longer being able to return to the life that we're living. Once there is the decision to go into it, there's no turning back. This is signifying a transformation or initiation process is about to begin. And there's an element of things are going to move forward whether or not you want to be involved. So part 2 now is the initiation process. This is what we have down here. So the initiation process typically starts out with the road of trials. So now we have some difficulty in that our hero or heroine is now being challenged in some way and learning from these challenges. They may not succeed. There may be a sense of failure with these, but there is a road of trials that is now helping the hero to lead to growth, which eventually will get them to the point of transformation. This is Katniss Everdeen when she's acquiring the sponsors. She's going through the different trials of her before she goes into the Hunger Games. This would also be when Neo is constantly going into the Matrix and he's being tested in the simulated reality of the Matrix, as opposed to going into the actual Matrix. The meeting with the goddess. So the hero encounters a powerful nurturing force that provides guidance and support. So I want to also acknowledge that the meeting of the goddess is not necessarily meeting of a woman in a particular way. This is the meeting of what the archetype of the goddess stands for, which is a different kind of energy. So this is like when Luke meets Princess Leia or when Frodo meets Galadriel. So the goddess, according to Campbell and Myers, is that myths of the Greek goddess teach compassion for all living beings. There you come to appreciate the real sanctity of the earth itself, because it has the body of the goddess. So we recognize that if we're looking at this from an internal process, that we are now finding compassion for ourselves to help us take us through this process. This is that moment in Lord of the Rings when Galadriel finds the compassion for Frodo to send him on his journey. And ultimately, if we remember this internal process, that this is happening inside of us. Next, we have temptation. The hero faces temptations that could divert them from their quest. This is when Odysseus is so tempted to listen to the songs of the sirens on his journey, on his return to Ithaca, that he actually ties himself up to the mast and has all of his sailors plug their ears with cotton so that they can't hear what's going on with the sirens, because the sirens' calls will lure men out to sea and then eventually kill them and eat them. And Odysseus wanted to hear this, so he ties himself up and listens to these temptations, and he's facing that moment of temptation of listening to those calls. This could be a moment in real life of addiction, or these easy ways out of doing what's difficult, of finding ourselves constantly stuck in our comfort zone of not doing, for instance, not taking a cold shower if that's what we want to be doing, or eating unhealthy foods because it's easier to do that than to cook a healthy meal. This is the moment in Lord of the Rings when Frodo's being tempted by the power of the One Ring to choose this ultimate sacrifice, which is the easier choice in the short run, but would lead to pain in the long run, which is what addiction essentially is. So there's that element of temptation trying to pull us away from our quest. Next, we have atonement with the father. So the hero confronts a paternal figure or authority seeking reconciliation. Remember that this is an internal process. This does not necessarily mean confronting the external, real life, real world father. We all have an internal father within us, the internal masculine, the father complex that exists inside of us. Atonement, or as one of my professors likes to say, at one-ment, that we are having a moment of coming together, of being at one. This is the moment in Lion King when Simba literally confronts Mufasa, who killed Simba's father. This is the moment in Luke Skywalker, that in Star Wars, when Luke Skywalker confronts his father, Darth Vader. But if you are unfamiliar with this scene, he's not actually fighting Darth Vader in this scene. He's going down and he's fighting an image of himself. And when he eventually kills Darth Vader in this scene of being down in the cave, he cuts his head off and he recognizes that it was him inside of Darth Vader's mask that he was killing. He recognized he's killing a former part of himself. He's not actually killing his father in this moment. So remember, this is the internal father, not the actual father. This is the father complex, the masculine, the protector, something inside of us that we have to wrestle with. And this is also the moment right on the verge of this where we have the abyss, or we have the death and rebirth right here. And so now, after the atonement with the father, we have the abyss. One thing that comes out in myths is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. The black moment is the moment when the real message of salvation is going to come. At the darkest moment comes the light. This is the death and rebirth. The death of self, apoptosis. The hero achieves a state of higher understanding or enlightenment. So apoptosis is a word that actually is a process in which our cells of our body commit suicide. For instance, babies, when we're born, due to our genetic heritage, we actually have webbed hands as infants inside of a mother's womb, and there's skin that goes all the way across the hands. And apoptosis is the process of cells committing suicide to then give us gaps in between our fingers. Same thing with the webbing of our toes as well. And so apoptosis is a suicidal process. It is, in actual sense, it means falling off or falling from. There's a fall of some kind. And so that leads to this idea of surrendering. Surrendering is like this falling into something else, of letting go of what we know so that we can become who we really are. This is a moment in the Buddhist philosophy when Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha attains enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, that there is a shift, a moment of death and recognition of something greater. Then we receive the ultimate boon. The hero obtains the object of the quest, gaining knowledge, power, or a boon. So this is in Indiana Jones, the retrieving of the Ark of the Covenant. We get what we were seeking through this process. That is what the ultimate boon is. It's the reward. And now we come to the return, which is the final part. We're now re-entering into our known universe. So there is, just like a refusal of the adventure, there's a refusal of the return as well, because we don't want to leave the magical world. We don't want to leave this special place that we were a part of. This is Frodo struggling to the return of the Shire after the destruction of the Ring in Lord of the Rings, that he comes back after this whole adventure, and he just loved his adventure so much, even though it was difficult. He doesn't want to return to the normalcy of everyday life. Same thing with Luke when he's on Dagobah, not wanting to go back out and fight. He really wanted to be and just stay there with Yoda and not return to the world that was calling to him. Then we have the magic flight, which is actually at the end of the story. There is some difficulty. This is the scene in Harry Potter when Harry, Hermione, and Ron face multiple challenges in their attempt to escape from the underground chambers, protecting the Philosopher's Stone. So now we have what we needed to have in order to fight off those different trials or challenges. And then we have rescue from without, recognizing that we do need help. This is the hero receives external help or intervention during the return. This is when Samwise Gamgee helps Frodo at the end of the story when Frodo's finger is bitten off and they are basically getting surrounded by lava, and Samwise Gamgee is there to help the hero out. He is the rescue from without. And then we have the crossing of the return of the threshold. The hero returns to the ordinary world, bringing the lessons of rewards of the journey. Now we are back at the same place that we started, yet we are different. Odysseus returning home to Ithaca after going out on his journey, recognizing that the journey to Ithaca was what was important, not the actual goal of arriving in Ithaca. And Harry Potter returning home, or returning back to Hogwarts after facing Voldemort in the Philosopher's Stone. So recognizing that we go back to where we began, yet we are different. And now we are the master of two worlds. So there is a marriage of some kind. So the hero integrates the wisdom or powers gained on the journey into their ordinary life. So this is Mulan now having the ability to be a warrior and a princess. She is both the known and the unknown, the masculine and the feminine. Same with the royal wedding here of Aladdin and Jasmine. They integrate both parts of the poor beggar and the royalty, the tension of the opposites, the masculine, the feminine. There's a sense of marriage, an archetypal marriage that exists. I'm not talking about actual heterosexual marriage. I'm talking about an archetypal marriage of the internal masculine and feminine, of the two opposites of good and evil, mastering both those two worlds. And then the freedom to live. So this is the end, when now we have completed our journey. We've received everything we need, and there's a new sense of balance and transformed life. This is when Elsa learns that it is the relationship with her sister is the key to controlling her powers. And you can recognize this if this is an internal process, that recognizing that this abandoned part is how she can now reconcile and how she can now control her powers is by bringing that abandoned part back into who she is. Same thing with Aragorn. Aragorn, now that he is king and has completed his journey, is now in service to the community. So there's a sense of returning to the community at the end of the journey. So I just want to hammer home a couple of points here to remember that A, the hero's journey is a circular process. So we are constantly spiraling through these different parts. And in our own internal lives, we may be at different parts. There may be parts of us that are at the call to adventure, parts that are at the abyss, parts that are coming up through the atonement. We may at different places in our relationships, in our vocation, in our spiritual life. And so recognizing that we can be at different places in different parts of the journey. We do not always have to go in the order of this as well. These can kind of be a little bit interchangeable too. And then remember that real life does not work in a linear fashion. Real life does not work in this very neat and clean way. In real life, we're going to be bouncing up and down, back and forth, and kind of just going through all of this process. In movies, in myth, yes, that is true that it seems a little bit more direct. In real life, we have moments of boredom and normalness, and to recognize that in our sense, in the human journey, is part of it as well, that real life does not work in this linear fashion. I also want to bring this in as well. Words of caution: do not identify with the archetype. We are not the gods. We are not Zeus, the great healer, the mother, or even hero. Our objective is not to identify with the archetype. That's what's known in Jungian psychology as ego inflation. According to Hillman, who in his book, The Soul's Code, he talked about this. So rather than conforming to a singular heroic narrative, Hillman encouraged individuals to explore and express the diverse array of archetypal possibilities within themselves, to recognize that the hero archetype is what we have been living for the past several thousand years. And according to Thomas More, heroes always have someone or something to fight or to do battle with. The hero archetype is, when it's accessed in its shadow form, is what causes wars, is what causes raping, pillaging, taking from others, this need for a sense of adventure. And although we do have that need, we can meet it in healthy ways. And the objective of the individuation process, or what we're talking about here, is not to identify with the hero, but to recognize that we have all of these different parts of ourselves, that there are different types of archetypes, as seen here. You know, the hero, the mentor, the trickster, the great mother, the villain, all of these parts exist inside of us. The hero is just one of these archetypal parts that exist inside of us and shows the mythic process within all of this. So I want to acknowledge that not only are we the hero, but we're also the mentor, the mother, the father, the great teacher, the self, the villain. And something about archetypes, and like I mentioned, you can go check out my archetype video if you want to see more about this, but something about archetypes is that they all carry every other archetype within them. So the hero carries the mentor, the trickster, the great mother, etc., and they all carry each other. So recognize that when we talk about the hero archetype, we're talking about all the archetypes, and yet not to identify that we are mere mortals and we are not the gods themselves. This is the structure and the psyche. I did a video on this as well. We've been talking down here about archetypes. And so that is like the base layer of the brain. This is where images are formed inside of the brain. So I wanted to give you a little bit of reference about what's going on in the psyche itself. So I want to leave you with this. The big question is whether you are going to be able to say a hearty yes to your adventure. That is by, of course, Joseph Campbell. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that would really help to get this video into YouTube's algorithm. I would really appreciate it. It's free to do, and it helps others to see this video as well. If you are ready to do the work, you can click the link down below and schedule a free consultation with me one-on-one, and we can explore what it would be like to work together. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.